Hi everyone, can you hear me? Okay. Bonjour Mathilde, bonjour à tous. Vous allez nous présenter vos travaux sur le traitement des données topo-bathymétriques en utilisant des méthodes de machine learning et de deep learning. Donc, devant un jury de 8 personnes. Alors, le jury est composé de Jean-Stéphane qui est directeur de recherche à AgroParisTech, Clément Mallet, qui est directeur de recherche à l'IGN et à l'Université de Gustave Eiffel. Et Jean-Stéphane Bailly et Clément Mallet sont les deux rapporteurs de votre thèse. Le jury est aussi composé de Bodo BOOKHAGEN, qui est professeur à l'Université de Potsdam, de MAGRUDER, qui est maître de conférence à l'Université de Texas, à l'Université d'Austin au Texas, de Charlotte Pelletier, qui est ici présente, qui est maître de conférence à l'Université de Bretagne Sud, de Thomas Corpetti, qui est directeur de recherche à l'Université au CNRS, qui est à l'Université de Rennes 2, et de Dimitri Lag, qui est directeur de recherche au CNRS, qui est à l'Université de Rennes 1, donc directeur de votre thèse. Et donc moi-même, Laurence HUBERT-MOY, qui suis professeur à l'Université de Rennes 2 et qui préside ce jeu. Donc, Mathilde, vous avez 45 minutes environ pour présenter les travaux que vous avez menés au cours de votre thèse. Donc, quand vous êtes prête, vous avez la parole. OK.
So thank you for the introduction, for attending my PhD defense and in particular to the committee members. So this work was made possible by the funding of the Brittany region and the South group. And it focused on environmental extraction. So this thesis was motivated for enhanced land interface areas observation, because these areas which include lakes, rivers, and coastal sources of threats. So monitoring them closely is very important. In particular, monitoring land water surface areas can be useful to identify flood or submersion hazard prediction, but also to study erosion or monitor different ecosystem services and morphodynamics. So, however, with traditional remote sensing two-dimensional imagery, it's difficult to monitor these areas efficiently because we don't have any three-dimensional information. Indeed, with the classical RGB imagery, there is no penetration of the sensor below vegetation and through the water surface, so no information can be collected below vegetation and water surface. And additionally, it is difficult to identify the objects based on their reflectance differences only and without geometry information. So to compensate for this need, I'm sorry, there is an issue with the notes. So to compensate for this need, 3D data can be acquired with topo-bathymetric lidar, which is a remote sensing tool based on active remote sensing and which relies on laser telemetry. So LiDAR can be used with near-infrared light, in which case it's unable to penetrate through the water surface, but it can also be used with green light, and in that case, the green light is able to penetrate through the water and thus provide imagery of the seabed. So topo-bathymetric LiDAR uses and operates both types of sensors simultaneously, resulting in 2 different point clouds and 2 different samplings of the same area. Thanks to that, it's able to provide uninterrupted sampling of land-water interface areas, which results in this kind of data, in which you can see all the advantages of the LiDAR data acquisition, which are 3D information on the trees, below vegetation, but also below water. So this thesis also takes place at a time where the availability of LiDAR survey is increasing, both in different sources in terms of platforms, but also on both spectral domains. So now let's take a closer look at the data delivered by topo-bathymetric LiDAR. So when using topo-bathymetric LiDAR, the first possibility is to collect 3D points that come from the application of the threshold to the received energy. Another possibility is to use, in a bathymetric case, the principle is the same, except that even though the water surface is not a concrete surface, it also generates a significant backscatter towards the sensor and is thus noticeable in the point clouds. A second option is to use the LiDAR waveform, which is a time series of received intensities by the sensor. And in that setting, each peak corresponds to one intercepted surface, because each time the laser beam hits a surface, the amount of energy sensed by the receiver increases. So physically, in practice, the waveform is the result of an operation of convolution received, which means that each the waveform components are characterized by a shape that depends and gives information on the intercepted surface. So bathymetric LiDAR, the same principle is applied in the waveform, except that where we would expect to have such a signal, the signal actually looks like that because of the presence of suspended particles in the water column, which results in a tension and scattering of light in this portion of the water column. As a result, the remaining energy for the seabed reflection is lower and the peak is less isolated. The difference between the ideal case and the actually observed case depends on the parameter, which is the diffuse attenuation coefficient, also called KD, and which is linked to water turbidity. In practice, in different turbidity settings, such as this very turbid water, characterized by a higher KD, the seabed return is very difficult to identify. On the opposite, in very clear waters, a lower KD will signify that the remaining energy for the seabed backscatter is higher. So the higher the value of KD, the more difficult it is to isolate the seabed return. Another characteristic that impacts is the reflectance of the hit surfaces. For example, a surface with a higher reflectance will generate a component with a higher amplitude, but also the geometry of the intercepted surface. Here, it's just to illustrate that different geometries of surface will generate different shapes for the waveform components. And the last parameter that impacts the global shape of the waveform is the vertical distribution of the targets on the path of. So in practice, the more if the two intercepted surfaces are too close vertically, their respective responses will overlap and become very difficult to separate. So if we sum up, LiDAR data is very rich. It contains information on the position of the different surfaces and their spatial distribution, but also in the waveforms, it gives information about the geometry of these intercepted surfaces and their material. However, it's also very difficult to process, regularly structured, so classical tools available for 2D imagery processing are impossible to use, in particular because of occlusions occurring in the point clouds and irregular densities. Secondly, the large diversity of classes that are present in topo-bathymetric environments make this data difficult to process. And also the fact that the spectral information contained in LiDAR point clouds is uncalibrated, which means that it cannot be used as an absolute spectral signature. Also, the presence of water is a significant difficulty for processing. First, because it alters the shape of the waveform and makes some returns difficult to exploit, but also because in some cases it provides no return in riverbeds and results in holes in the point cloud. And last but not least, the complexity of the waveforms is also very difficult to handle. Here you have an ideal case in which the two backscatters are very easy to identify, but in which both returns are highly overlapping, or this one, in which the signal-to-noise ratio is so low in the remaining part after the backscatter of the surface that the seabed is impossible to detect straightforwardly. So there are still very numerous open questions regarding knowledge extraction from topo-bathymetric lidar. In particular, there is a need for accessible tools for characterization, description, and interpretation of bispectral automatic to handle the massive amount of data that are collected, but also accessible to non-specialists of computer science. And also, we need adapted signal processing methods that can handle the complexities of the lidar waveform. And in that particular context, we may wonder to what extent the progress that took place in parallel to the development of lidar in terms of data processing and artificial intelligence could help. So during my PhD, we focused on developing methods for knowledge extraction, and we worked on two different levels of knowledge types. The first being semantic information, and the second being about estimating quantitative parameters from the bathymetric waveform. So more details, we first worked on bispectral point cloud classification, turned towards semantic segmentation of lidar waveforms using a unit-based deep neural network in order to be able to both detect and classify the returns in the waveform. Then we evaluated to what extent deep neural networks could help us redetect bathymetric returns, in particular in challenging settings, by assessing pattern detection and identification using deep learning. We also investigated to what extent the shape of the bathymetric waveform could be used to derive water-related parameters. And we also explored signal decomposition to retrieve from one observed bathymetric waveform the three individual components of the water surface, the water column, and the water bottom. So today I will be focusing only on two of these developments, which will be the bispectral point cloud classification and the water parameters estimation. So now I will start with the bispectral point cloud classification workflow. So in practice, when we obtain lidar data, this is what we get. So for example, here this point cloud is colored with elevation, which means that there is absolutely no semantic information in the data originally. However, if we want to perform scientific assessments, for example, submersion risk modeling or biomass assessments, we need, in the first case, to isolate the water surface and the water bottom, and in the second case, to isolate the vegetation from the rest of the scene. So to be able to perform that, we need to be able to attribute to each point of the point cloud a label representing its nature, which corresponds to performing point cloud classification. Now, the big question is, how do you get from this to this? And in practice, what's currently made is to exploit the information contained in the point cloud by first labeling points for which we know their nature, computing and defining descriptors of this information of the point cloud, and training an algorithm to recognize the link between the description of the data and the nature of the labeled point cloud. So this is well mastered in urban environments, as you can see in these figures that illustrate the existing methods for point cloud classification, and also in forested environments, but it is not usually studied in mixed or topo-bathymetric settings, so there is still a lack of methods adapted to the presence of 2-point clouds in 2 different wavelengths, and both below and above water. So in that context, we proposed 3D mask, which is a 3D points classification method based on multiple attributes, scales, and clouds. And we did so in order to tackle this first need that we identified in the introduction, which was the need for description, characterization, and interpretation of bispectral point clouds. So to develop 3D mask, we studied 2 different topo-bathymetric areas in order to assess its performances. The first is a coastal area located in Fréjus in Brittany, and the second is a river located in the south of France. So we also investigated 2 different levels of detail to see where we could go in terms of precision of the classification. We first played with 5 classes that were quite broad, and then split them into more detailed land and sea covers. So since 3D mask is based on supervised learning, we had to label training data and test data. So we manually labeled 2,000 points for the training test, the training set, and 2,000 other points for the test data sets, which were always separated by at least 20 meters to avoid spatial bias during evaluation. The goal is to describe and compute descriptors of the data. So in 3D mask, we first start by describing each point cloud separately. And for that, we have 3 possibilities. The first is to describe the geometry of the point cloud. This can be made with different types of features, including dimensionality-based features, which describe the planarity, linearity, or sphericity of the data. But there are also other types of descriptors, such as height range, eco-ratio, or roughness and verticality of the point cloud. Another type of feature that can be used to describe each wavelength separately is the spectral behavior of the active remote sensing part of the data. So the backscattered lidar intensity, which as you can see here, is very different depending on the land or sea cover. And one last possibility is to exploit the red, green, blue reflectance obtained by a simultaneous camera acquisition. However, as I explained at the beginning of this presentation, 2D imagery is not able to penetrate through water or vegetation, so exploiting this information means that the color attributed to the topmost layer would be the same than the one of the bottom layer. So this may be a disadvantage. So once we have studied each point cloud separately, another source of information is to exploit the differences of sampling between both of them, because the near-infrared wavelengths and the green wavelengths do not behave similarly underwater and in vegetation. So for that, we introduce dual point cloud features, which were made to describe and encode the differences in sampling between the 2 wavelengths. Here, for example, I illustrated the example of the difference of elevation between the 2 point clouds, and you can see that it makes the submerged parts such as swimming pools or the riverbed stand out very significantly. So in the end, if we combine single point cloud descriptors with dual point cloud descriptors, we end up with 88 features per scale, but 3D mask is also able to perform multi-scale feature computation. So in that setting, we get more than 2,000 features, which works very well in terms of classification, but is also heavy to compute and results in redundant information. So to deal with this issue and reduce the computation costs, but also increase the interpretability of the results, we also implemented an automatic predictor selection procedure in the plugin, which enables us to reduce by a large amount the number of predictors needed, while preserving the classification performance, which here is represented with the out-of-bag score, which also describes the generalizability of the classification. So you can see that in both areas and for the two different levels of details, this workflow enables us to reduce the number of predictors without impacting too severely the classification accuracy. Qualitatively, the results we get after this predictor selection look like this, which is quite precise, but in terms of quantitative results, we observe that the results show that the classification accuracy is systematically higher than 90%, which means that for all experiments, 90% of the points were correctly classified. And in particular, what is interesting to notice is that these high performances are obtained for both levels of details, but also even after reducing the amount of predictors needed by up to 95%. So this results in light classifiers between around 20 and 40 features and scales, even in a large number of classes setting. Another advantage of this selection of the automatic selection procedure is that it increases interpretability and it enables us to make recommendations in terms of useful predictors for different topo-bathymetric scenes. For example, what we noticed is that by studying the contribution of different families of features to the classification accuracy in riverine and coastal areas, the newly introduced eco-based features were systematically the topmost performing features and also always outperformed classical geometrical features which were used before for point cloud classification. To better understand to what extent our features were highly descriptive, we also compared them with the existing point cloud classification methods that were illustrated at the beginning of this part. And we observed that 3D mass consistently outperformed these four methods, but also that if we combined our descriptors with those of each of these methods, the accuracy was not improved, which suggests that the descriptive power of the 3D mask feature is very high. So to conclude about 3D mask, we proposed a method to perform 3D classification with high accuracy by proposing light classifiers that are also easy to interpret and require a low amount of training samples. With that, we contributed to these first challenges identified in the introduction, which made us outline the need for adapted bispectral point cloud classification waveforms. But first, I'm going to introduce deep neural networks because in 3D mask we used supervised machine learning, which was based, as you could see, on a large amount of feature engineering and then the training of the classifier. But the issue with such methods is that sometimes it can be difficult to design efficient descriptors for the data, and also that some problems cannot be handled with too low complexity methods. So to answer these needs, a possibility is to use deep learning to learn the features in order to get more features that are more adapted to the complexity of the problem. And for that, a possibility is to use convolutional neural networks. So here I'm going to illustrate the principle on convolutional neural networks on a very random image. But in practice, we did this on one-dimensional waveforms, which are just a type of one-dimensional image. So the idea behind deep convolutional neural networks is to perform filtering of the image by sliding a window with weights, which is going to extract filters to describe the data. For example, we can describe the edges of the image, but also its spectral behavior. And these operations are repeated successively at different scales in order to be able to describe the image the most exhaustively possible. So this is traditionally represented with this kind of schematic